Welcome, welcome. And of course, you know that on Sundays, this is actually a Sunday, we do Torah Temimah. We do something a little bit different. So we will be doing that today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, go into the screen share as soon as it does that. Just my computer is taking its time today. So let's see how this works. Yep, I must have too many things open. I may just close some applications and try and see. There we go. Let me close that. It's not letting me do that. Oh, computers are great things and they can be very frustrating too. Forgive me for taking up the time to do this. Ouch. It is just turning and turning and turning. Okay. I'm so sorry. Let's try and see if it'll go to. Yep, that should help, I hope. All right, let's see if it does. Okay. All right, I'm assuming you can see my shared screen. So let's start here. Vayvarach Elohim et Yom HaShvi'i. So we said God blessed the Sabbath day. Vaykadesh oto, and he hallowed it, he sanctified it. Ki vo Shabbat mikol lachto, for on it he had ceased from all his labor. Asher bara Elohim la'asot, which God had created to make. Lots of words there, but we're going to look at Vayvarech, Vaykadesh. He blessed it and he sanctified it. And there's a lovely coincidence here, because when we were studying Yitro this past week and studying the Ten Commandments, we came across this phrase again, and we actually had a reference to what is going to be said now in the Torah Temimah. And that's supposed to be a very lovely sort of sign, that coincidence of two different texts, but that they happen to be in alignment right now. So, Vayvarech Vaykadesh, he blessed and he sanctified. So those terms definitely need clarification, right? Ba'meh barcho v'kidsho. How did he bless those and sanctify the Sabbath? Barcho b'man, he blessed it with the manna, v'kidsho b'man, and he sanctified it through the manna. And when we studied this in Parshat Yitro, Rashi explains exactly how that worked with the manna, but specifically with the manna. So let's take a look. We'll dive right into the Torah Temimah here. Inyan habracha v'hakidush b'man. So the issue that we're talking about, that it was blessed and sanctified with the manna, pashutu, it's pretty straightforward. Here we go. Shebe'et yiridat Haman, because at the time when the manna was descending, lo haya yored b'Shabbat, it didn't descend on the Sabbath. Kemevuar beParshat Beshalach, as is stated or explained in Parsha Beshalach. It's the Parsha that discusses the Song of the Red Sea, and right after that we have the passage dealing with the manna, and after that the Ten Commandments. Vezehu mipnei kedushat hayom, and that is because the day is sanctified. In other words, the fact that the manna did not appear on the Sabbath has to do with how that day was different from all the other days of the week, the other 6 days when the manna appeared. And that is the nature of sanctification. In other words, it's a way of making it unique, and understanding that the word to sanctify is similar, has the basic understanding of making something different and unique. That's the nature of sanctification. When you sanctify something, you make it one of a kind, you make it unique. V'im ze nitbarech hayom, and together with this, the day was blessed, ki yarad avuro kiflayim be'erev Shabbat, because to make up for this, twice the amount of manna fell on Friday. And we did talk about this, of course, and the nature of blessing, meaning plenitude. So, ולא היו צריכים להטריח בשבת ללקוט כנודע. And so, as a consequence, they didn't have to go to any trouble on Shabbat to gather up the manna as is understood. V'yayin od lefanenu, and look further as we approach it, the inyan zeh, regarding this matter, beParshat Beshalach, when we get to Parshat Beshalach, beParshat Yitro, and also in the Parsha of Yitro. And now he's going to go into a halachic issue, and that's something that we deal with in Torah Temimah, is that Rashi does deal to some extent with halacha, but Torah Temimah is going to go much deeper into these issues of what are we, how do we comport our lives? How do we sanctify our lives in this particular way? And acting with a halachic consciousness, that is, with a sense that we have divine commandments to fulfill in the course of our lives, every moment and every day, is something that's a very important element of what Judaism tries to present to us in discovering how we develop significance as human beings. So now he's going to go into it. So there's a tractate called Moed Katan, and it deals, I believe, with the intermediate days of the festivals. So on page Kaf Gimel, page 23, the B side of the page, but Tosafot, these are Rashi's grandchildren who get deeply into halachic issues and also what are called legally novellae, meaning new applications of law. So you're going to see there's going to be an application of this idea of Shabbat being sanctified and blessed in this comment that they're going to make. Divrei HaMatchil Man de Amar. So there's a comment, this section where we can identify them on that page by the fact that they start this discussion of theirs with the words Man de Amar, the one who says. I believe that's what this abbreviation means here. Shekatvu, that they wrote, Tosafot wrote, Al Pi HaYerushalmi. This is with reference to the Jerusalem Talmud, because there's a Babylonian Talmud. That is generally the Talmud. When we just talk about the Talmud, we're talking about the Babylonian Talmud. There's parallel to that a Jerusalem Talmud. So, Vahu bebrachot Perik Bet Halacha Zayin, and the Talmud Yerushalmi is actually organized differently from the Talmud Bavli, that is the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud reference are given by page numbers and the A side of the page and the B side of the page. But the Talmud Yerushalmi is organized differently into chapters, Perik Bet, chapter 2, and those chapters are then subdivided into halachot, and that would be halacha zayin, that is halacha 7. Tam hadavar, so the reason for the fact, she'ein avelut noheg b'Shabbat, this is the new idea that is going to come under this rubric, that is to say that mourning customs do not operate on the Sabbath. So we know that there are mourning customs such as the removal of shoes and the sitting on low benches and things like that, and wearing your shiva ribbon, for example, or torn. Originally, you were to actually make a tear in your garment. They do not apply on the Sabbath. Mishum dichtiv, because it's written in Proverbs chapter 10. This is what the Yerushalmi uses as its source for this particular halacha. Birkat Hashem hi ta'ashir, the blessing of the Lord enriches, velo yosif etzev ima, and it does not increase sadness with it. So, when God blesses you, this is what the pshat seems to be of this particular verse, that the blessing of God only enriches, and there is no sadness associated with it. B'Shabbat ketiv be, and regarding Shabbat, it says bracha. It refers to a bracha, right? It says God blessed the Sabbath day. Ad kan lishono. This is the end of the quotation. V'romez lepasuk shelefanenu, and that is alluding to this verse that we are looking at in Genesis, Diftiv vayvarech Elohim et yom hashmi'i, where it says, God blessed the Sabbath day. So they're taking this verse in Proverbs and they're applying it to the verse that we have here. And QED, you don't have any mourning on the Sabbath because mourning involves practices of mourning are there to allow you to express sadness and grief. So he's a little bit concerned about this explanation. He says, and one can, it's appropriate to clarify, l'cheora, okay, on the surface, lama leila Yerushalmi. What's the reason that the Yerushalmi uses tam zeh, this particular argumentation? Why does the Yerushalmi give this sort of distant, complicated explanation? He says this. First of all, they're running to Proverbs for the basis of this halacha, and then Then you have the connection to the Genesis chapter 1 verse, and you've got these sort of implications that are all in this. Tipo Clay, he should have simply derived the fact that you don't mourn on the Shabbat. Disvara leila Yerushalmi. Gufe, because in the Yerushalmi itself, it states the Shabbat nikra Yom Simcha, that the Shabbat is referred to as a day of joy, right? The imkain mimela, and if that's so, automatically, ein noheg bo alavulit, you can say, ergo, you don't observe mourning customs on Shabbat because it's a day of Simcha. Kamo b'Yom Tov, just similar to the Yom Tov. The same applies. Mishum Simcha, because we talk about, what do we say on Yom Tov? We say Chag Sameach. That's what we say, right? And both Shabbat and Yom Tov involve Simcha. Shekain ita b'Yerushalmi b'Gilat. He says in the Yerushalmi itself. And by the way, this is a demonstration of the brilliance of Baruch Halevi Epstein, that he has this encyclopedic knowledge, not only of the Talmud Bavli, but also the Yerushalmi. He has this reference to Megillah, Tractate Megillah, Perek Aleph, chapter 1, halacha Dalet. Again, you see how it's arranged. Fourth halacha. Su'udat Purim. So, of course, the Tractate Megillah deals with, amongst other things, the festival of Purim, right? Because we read the Megillat Esther, right? At any rate, the Purim feast, Shechal b'Shabbat, that if it falls on Shabbat, Me'achrin ota, we delay it ad la'achar haShabbat, until after the Shabbat. Why? Mishum dichtiv bePurim la'asot otam yemei Mishteh v'simcha, because regarding the days of Purim, we are commanded to make them days of feasting and joy. Et shesimachto tluya bebeit din, and when it comes to a simcha that is based on a beit din, on a court, and he's going to explain exactly how the mishteh of Purim, that the feast of Purim depends on the declaration of a court. Ibur Hashanah, in other words, when it comes to intercalating the calendar, the Jewish calendar, intercalations is a reference to adding days and adding months. V'Kiddush HaChodesh, and also likewise determining the beginning of the month. And it would take a long explanation for me to explain, but this is dependent on a Bet Din, originally the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, declaring the new moon. I will go to the extent of saying that the complication is that the lunar month is approximately 29 and a half days. It's not an exact number of days. And so when you go from one month to another month, they would depend initially on the first sighting of the new moon. They would know that after 29 days, then at that point, there should be a new moon to appear, and they'd have people who are stationed in different locations near Jerusalem to look for a new moon. The new moon, by the way, appears in the western sky, and it disappears very quickly. It appears low in the western sky very soon after sunset. And so you have to look very carefully to observe a new moon. And if two independent witnesses, saw the new moon, they'd run to the Sanhedrin and tell them what they'd sighted, and the Sanhedrin would declare that the beginning of a new month. And of course, if they didn't see it on the 30th day, then they would know automatically that the new moon, the new month would begin the following day. That is, it would have to be, because a lunar month is 29 and a half days. So Yatzah Shabbat, so you cannot include in this feast of Purim, because the feast of Purim is dependent on a date, right? The 14th of Adar. And when that new moon begins, or when the new month begins, is dependent on a declaration of the Bet Din, because the new month can either appear 30 days after the previous month or 31 days after the previous month, the new moon. So you have to wait for the declaration of the Bet Din. Yatzah Shabbat, so that leaves out Shabbat. Shesimchato tluya bidei shamayim. Why? Because Shabbat, its joy is dependent on heaven, meaning that we know that God declared the seventh day, so we simply count the seventh day. That does not depend on a Bet Din declaring the seventh day. We know when a day begins, and we know which day is Friday. That is dependent on heaven. Adkan, this is the end of that explanation. Klomar, that is, so this in this tract in Megillah, in the Yerushalmi Megillah, they discuss this, right? So the Feast of Purim has to take place. If it falls on Shabbat, you have to delay it. In other words, if the 14th of Adar falls on Shabbat, you have to delay the Feast of Purim till after Shabbat. Klomar, that is to say, Sheyom HaShabbat Kadosh ve'omed mibli tzorech. That is to say, that the sanctity of the Shabbat stands without any need, and the next word is going to be Beit Din, without any need for a Beit Din lekadsho to declare it sanctified. And so it is clear, Disfara Leila Yerushalmi, that the Yerushalmi holds the Shabbat Nikra Yom Simcha. So clearly, here we have, right there in Tractate Megillah, that Shabbat is considered a Yom Simcha, and you don't mix the Simcha of Shabbat with the Simcha of Purim. V'tzarich lomar, and so we need to say, Daha gufa de Shabbat nikra Yom Simcha, right? That in fact, the very fact that Shabbat is considered a Yom Simcha, a day of joy, Lamad HaYerushalmi mi pasuk ze de Mishlei sheheved. So we'd have to say that the reason, going back, is that the reason for this Megillah statement, though, is the fact that it learned that Shabbat is a day of Simcha from this Proverbs verse that was quoted before. Demi dichtiv birkat Hashem hi ta'ashir, because it says the blessing of the Lord enriches, v'lo yasif etzev ima, and there is no addition, any element of sadness together with that blessing. And so that's the Proverbs verse, V'shabbat kativ ba bracha. And so we've got this bracha, right? We have the bracha that is associated with simcha. Mevu'ar dechayav b'simcha. And so consequently, we now know that the Shabbat requires simcha. There's a chiyuv, there's an obligation to be joyous on Shabbat. V'divrei hatzat tosafot tzarich iyon, And with regards to the words of the Tosafot that we were talking about, we need further investigation. They need to be looked at very carefully. The lama le kol ha'arichut. Why does the Tosafot require all this lengthy explanation? Because they could have just simply said, Lefaresh pshitut. They could have explained very simply, al piha Yerushalmi, but through the Yerushalmi, de kevan de Shabbat chayav besimcha, that since one is obligated to be joyous on Shabbat, lachein ein avilut noheget bo kamo b'yom tov. And that's the reason why you do not have mourning customs on Shabbat, just as you don't have them on Yom Tov, on Yom Tov. For al kol panim, but he says, nevertheless, tameh ani, I'm still kind of surprised, he says. Not kind of, but very, very surprised. He says, I'm very surprised. Yes, David.
So does that mean that you actually do have mourning customs on Purim? Because they've gone through the whole as far as I understand it, what you basically said is Purim is separated, from Shabbat, right? Even though it's a simcha. So anyway,
but it is Yom Tov, so no, there's no mourning on Purim either.
Okay.
Right? He said, there's no mourning on Yom Tov, and there's no mourning is suspended on Shabbat as well. So that's the reason. So no, there's no mourning. It's the issue of having the feast of Purim, because there's a custom or a halacha to have a seudat Purim. Purim recalls days of feasting, etc.
Right.
And so on Purim, the feast of Purim itself, we express our joy through having a feast, a special feast on Purim. So you don't combine the feast of Purim with the feast of Shabbat, is the point that's being made here. That you can have two separate feasts.
Right. Okay.
The feast of Shabbat, the special food you're supposed to have on Shabbat to express the joy of Shabbat, and a separate feast of Purim to express the joy of Purim.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. So we're in the midst of him saying that he's still very surprised. Al kol ma shekatov eze achronim. So he goes on to a different things. He says, I'm really surprised what certain achronim are exponents of halacha, people who have written about halachic issues that follow the Shulchan Aruch, that acharonim. So we divide halachic time in various ways, and in this way, any authority that follows the publication of the Shulchan Aruch is considered an acharon, and that takes us to our own time period now. So any halachic expert and exponent nowadays is called an acharon. And there are practical issues involved in terms of how one applies halacha depending on the nature of their authority. And part of the issue is that the further we get from Mount Sinai, from the time of Mount Sinai, the less authoritative the authority has. So at any rate, they said bepshitut, right? They say clearly, de b'Shabbat ein chiyuv simcha. They say quite explicitly that there is no requirement for joy on Shabbat. Look at that. No wonder he is very surprised, because we've just gone through a pretty clear proof, right? And from the Talmud Yerushalmi, from Talmudic times, which means they have tremendous authority, and an acharon has no right to say something that directly contradicts something that is said as explicitly as it is in Talmudic times. And he gives an example. So there's a commentator, a halachic commentator known as Bechor Shor. He actually is quite a well-known and considered, on general, a very fine authority. Chidushay means the novella, right? In other words, the new halachic laws that come out from older ones. And he gives you the reference, Ta'anit Lamed. So this is his comments on Tractate Ta'anit, which deals with fast days page 30, or number 30. V'halo miyerushalmi shehevenu. And look at this from the Yerushalmi that we were citing for alpi ma shebe'arnu, and based on what we were clarifying, we've explained mevo'ar meforash hahefech mizeh. The exact opposite is clearly the case. The Shabbat chayav b'simcha, that in fact on Shabbat one is obligated to have express ways to joy. Ve'imishum de bidivrei Kabbalah matzanu rak, right? So, and if just from the words of the prophets we find rak v'karata l'shabbat oneg, if we'd only found this verse, I think is what he is saying. There's a verse in Isaiah, chapter 58, in that chapter of Isaiah, it says, "V'karata l'shabbat oneg," you shall declare the Sabbath a pleasure. Ach ma b'chach, right? Well, if that were the only place, right, we would say, that doesn't mean that it's simcha. It just says you shall call it a pleasure. De yesh lomar pashut, because one can say clearly, de levad chiyuv simcha tzarich likro gam oneg. So we would be able to say clearly that not only is there an obligation, in other words, this is based on what he has said before, right? That not only do we have to make sure that Shabbat is a day of joy, tzarich likro gam oneg, it also needs to be a day of pleasure. Mishum de simcha v'oneg shnei inyanim shonim hei. And the reason why is that both simcha and oneg are two different things. So I need to go back on what I'm saying to say that were we only to have that verse in Isaiah, you might be able to justify the fact that Shabbat is not a day of simcha. If that was all we had, right? In that case, we could understand what the Bechor Shor is saying in saying that the day it's not a day of simcha, because the verse in Proverbs only talks about it being oneg, right? But clearly that's not the issue. Kamosha Katov b'Shabbat Samech Bet Bet, and the fact that we know that pleasure and simcha are two separate issues. Okay, we probably need to puzzle on that a little bit, right? But anyway, apparently pleasure and joy are two different things. But in the Tractate Shabbat, page 62b, Kol midei de it be ta'anug, the it be simcha, it talks about all things where there is both pleasure and joy, etc. Bechol midei, and it also mentions those things, de it be ta'anug, velit be simcha. There are things which may in fact involve ta'anug, pleasure, velit be simcha, but aren't necessarily joyous. So here we have, again, in the Talmud, a statement that makes a distinction between these two things. V'yoter mizeh mitzati. And not only that, I have found, but the point is this: he has proved that that Shabbat is also considered a day of simcha, and so to just use the quote of Isaiah, which talks about the Shabbat as oneg, and to say, well, that's why we don't have to consider Shabbat a day of simcha, is no good. That's not a good argument, because there are in fact clear references that talk about the Shabbat being a day of simcha. All right. V'yoter mizeh matzati, and not only this, he said, I found shegam haTorah kra'a Shabbat yom simcha, that in the Torah itself it refers to the Sabbath as a day of simcha, a day of joy. Im ki beremes, even if it's just an allusion, it may not state it explicitly, but it alludes to it. Shekain mevu'ar b'sifrei Parshat Bahalotcha, because we find again another work, an earlier work, Sifrei, I've mentioned that is this halachic midrash on both Numbers and Deuteronomy, and it's in this case it is in the Sifrei on Bahalotcha, that's in the book of Numbers, okay. Uvayom simchatchem, there it says in the book of Numbers, on the day of your simcha, the day of your joy, uva mo'adechem, and on your appointed seasons. So the Sifrei says, Uvayom simchatchem, if it just says on the day of your joy, zeh Shabbat. That's referring to the Shabbat. Ve'iyen sham shebahagaot hagara, and he says, look at the commentary of the Vilna Gaon Rabbi Eliezer, on his notes on the Sifrei. So the point is this, right? It doesn't say Shabbat, it just says the day of your joy. That's what he says that's what the Torah Temimah means when he says, while it doesn't say it explicitly, it does give a very strong suggestion, and that is a traditional, when the Sifrei is saying Yom Simchatchem is referring to the Shabbat, because the Mo'adechem is the festivals, right? That it's a very good proof that Shabbat is considered a Yom Simcha. V'chein nir'eh ra'aya machrechet, right? And there is also a compelling proof lechiyuv simcha b'Shabbat, for the obligation to be joyous on the Shabbat. Mima shekatuv b'sifrei, from what is written in the Sifrei. Remember, the Sifrei is a halachic midrash. We base halacha. It's part of what is the process of creating halacha. Parshat Re'eh, in the Parsha of Re'eh, this is in the book of Deuteronomy, that kol hamoadim chayiv b'simcha, that all the appointed times require simcha, midichtiv, from what is written, b'shavuot, regarding the festival of Shavuot, v'samachta, v'zacharta, you shall be joyous, v'zacharta, and remember, ki eved hayita b'mitzrayim, that you were a slave in Egypt. Let me explain that part of the joy of Shavuot, at least according to the Torah, is that the reason why we can be joyous is because it is associated with the fact that we were freed from slavery in Egypt. And I would think that basically, for the most part, being rescued from an abusive slavery would be a source of joy. The point, though, he's going to make is we've got the association of simcha, of joy, with the redemption from Egypt. So, umikevan shekol hamuadim, and because, although this is mentioned only regarding to the festival of Shavuot, but since all the appointed festivals, Haim Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, remember, they're all considered a remembrance of the exodus from Egypt. Lachein mechuyavim kulam b'simcha, and that is why all the festivals require and obligated for us to be joyous. Adkan, this is the point made in the Sifrei here. Ulefize, and according to this, this could be something in the it could be in a commentary. I'm not sure. This could be him. That is Torah Temimah mentioning this. Although when he says Adkan, that suggests a quote, a quotation. So let's see. So maybe this is, although the Umekevan Shekol HaMoadim Haim does not sound like the language of the Sifrei, but perhaps it is. I'd have to actually look at the reference. At any rate, Ulefize, and according to this, the Shabbat, regarding the Shabbat, right? We just mentioned the festivals, but we know that with regard to Shabbat, and in the Deuteronomy version of the Ten Commandments, regarding the commandment of Shabbat, it says, "V'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim." You shall remember when you observe the Shabbat that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and mimela, and you can say, ergo, mechuyavim b'simcha, right? Since we're saying that joy, simcha, is associated with remembering how God redeemed us from slavery in Egypt, and since on Shabbat it also makes that connection, you are obligated to be joyous. V'zeh ra'aya ne'emena. And you can consider this a compelling proof. V'yesh od rayot lazeh. And there are further proofs to this. V'gam al pi hasvara nir'echen. And not only that, just logically, it would appear to be the case. De kafishi adua b'Torah, right? This is also very interesting that it is known by Torah that regard for in the Torah, kiblu Yisrael et mitzvot Shabbat b'mara be'ahava. It is understood that Israel, the Jewish people, received the commandment to observe the Shabbat in the place called Mara, be'ahava, with love. They loved the fact that they were receiving the mitzvah of Shabbat. It was, of course, in connection with the manna, because they were told that on Shabbat there would be no manna. V'lo k'sha'ar mitzvot b'matan Torah, and not with all the other mitzvot when the Torah was given, al yedei kfiyat ha'ar kenoda. There is, some of you know, there is a midrash that says that when the Jews were receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, God lifted the mountain over them and said, either you accept my mitzvot or I drop the mountain on you. A lot of symbolism involved there regarding the consequences of rejecting the mitzvot. But the point is, all those were done, in a sense, with necessity and not so much simply out of love. In other words, that when it came to accepting the mitzvah of Shabbat in Mara, the Jewish people accepted it simply out of love. In other words, it's similar to someone saying to you to do something, and the fact that you love them so much is enough of a reason. Asher mita'am zeh mosifim betfilat Yom Tov, and for this reason, that is to say, because the Israelites accepted the mitzvah of Shabbat and Mara with love, for this reason we add in the Tfilat Yom Tov, in the Amida of Yom Tov, Shechal b'Shabbat, if that Yom Tov falls on the Sabbath, you quote these words, we put into the Amida, Vatitin lanu be'ahava. We add the word be'ahava into the formulation of giving us the festival, right? So the Shabbat and the festival. Ukazeh omrim betfilah uvekiddush shel Shabbat, and likewise one says in the prayer and the kiddush of Shabbat, we add be'ahava, we say be'ahava, in love. The Amru b'Shabbat Kaf Lamed Aleph, and in the tractate Shabbat, page 130a, Kol mitzvah shekiblu Yisrael alehem b'simcha, any commandment which the Israelites accepted upon themselves with joy, adain osim ota b'simcha. For that reason, to this very day, we perform these mitzvot with joy. And if that's the case, b'vadai, we can be certain, ra'ui lehiyot b'simcha b'Shabbat. Right? We know they did. We know that Shabbat is associated with simcha from that reference to Shavuot, b'yom simchatchem, the day of your joy, v'chein yeduyak lashon hatfilah. And for that reason, the wording of the prayer Yismechu b'malchutcha. This is we know this is part of the tefillah of Shabbat. It says, may they rejoice in your sovereignty. Shomrei Shabbat, those who observe the Sabbath. It all ties together. He has connected the dots. Umimotza davar. And the outcome of all this discussion, tir'eh, you see, ki ein kol hechrech lama shekatuv ari. There is no need, just from what we are saying, there is no need for what the Ri is one of the Tosafot, rabbis mentioned in the Tosafot, that for what he wrote, Bebrachot Reish Per Gimel, in Brachot at the beginning of chapter 3, unless this is referred to, I'm going to say chapter 3. De'ein kol chiyuv le'echol basar b'Shabbat. So the Ri said in that Tosafot that there is no obligation to eat meat on Shabbat. He says there is none. Veheviu ra'aya mima shekatov, and the Tosafot there bring a proof from what is written in Shabbat, in the tractate Shabbat, page 118a. Aseh Shabbatcha chol, make your Shabbat a weekday. In other words, you may have to do things that are not allowed on Shabbat. Ve'al titzarech labriot, and you do not make yourself dependent on others. In other words, you shouldn't be depending on others in order to make your Shabbat. If you need to do something in order to not to have to be dependent on others to observe Shabbat, you should not observe Shabbat. Ulefi mashekatavnu, mashekatuv, the Shabbat mechuyav b'simcha, and according to what we wrote, that on Shabbat one is obligated b'simcha, to be joyous. Mimela, we can say automatically mechuyavim b'achilat basar, that in fact one is obligated to eat meat. In other words, for the Tosafot to just make a general statement that one doesn't need to eat meat on Shabbat, from the statement of not making yourself dependent on others as a general statement, doesn't fly, because we've got another statement that says you need to make Shabbat a joyous day. And so we could say that yes, it's true, if you have to depend on others for your Shabbat, you don't eat meat, but you can't make a general statement that you don't have to eat meat on Shabbat, period. It would only be in the circumstance where in order to eat meat, you'd have to be borrowing money from people to pay for the meat. But if you can afford to eat meat on Shabbat, you have an obligation to eat meat. Ukamosha katov b'psachim kuftet Aleph, and is written in the tractate Psachim, page 109a, Ein simcha ela babasar. It says, there is no joy except in the consumption of meat. That meat is something that is essentially an expression of joy. And we've now connected more dots. Okay. And look further what we have written at the end of Parshat Re'eh. Okay. And the proof that they brought, the Tosafot brought, from that, make your Shabbat a weekday, etc. Ra'aya kalusha. It's a weak proof. The Iyain Od, and see further, the Beit Yosef. This is a major commentator on the actually he precedes the Shulchan Aruch. Beit Yosef is a commentary on Shulchan Aruch by Joseph Caro, the Orech Chaim, but he also before the Shulchan Aruch was written, I believe, the Tur. But anyway, Beit Yosef, forgive me for being so convoluted here. Beit Yosef is a commentary on the Tur, actually, on the Tur. The Orech Chaim, the Tur is organized just the same way as the Shulchan Aruch. As I said, it precedes Jacob ben Asher. I'm trying to think, is the author of the Tur. At any rate, Beit Yosef is a commentary on the Tur. Siman, trying to think, forgive me, who the author is. At any rate, it's a major work. Siman and excuse me, yes, he also wrote the Orech Chaim, but before he wrote the Orech Chaim, he wrote this commentary on the Tur, Siman Reish Pei Aleph, and you can find it in the chapter 281, and before us, the Parshat Emor. If you look at Parshat Emor, B'inyan Shabbat, that's Emor, of course, is in Leviticus, and regarding the Sabbath, V'kan ein laharich od, and right now he says one cannot go any further, and we've taken a long time to get into this, and so I'm going to stop here, and we will look at this next time. We'll continue from here. Yes. So Joseph Caro is the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and the Beit Yosef was also written by Joseph Caro on the Torah.